Right, good morning everyone. Welcome to the online Sustainable Food Conference. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. It's a real pleasure to host you all in this really groundbreaking conference, which we've been working on for a number of months. And I'm sure we're all here and we all agree that the purpose of the event is to really target the challenges that are facing the UN Sustainable Development Goals and our global food supply chain challenges, which is really ahead. Now, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our moderator, Sarah Reversi, for our first panel on food and the SDGs. Sarah is the president of the Future Food Institute. But before I leave you all in her very capable hands, just like a quick reminder for everyone to get involved in the chat function, use Swapcard to its fullest, book your one-to-one meetings, and do ask as many questions as possible during the next hour. We will be sharing them with the panelists, and I'm sure if you
Okay, welcome everyone. Thank you so much for the introduction. And I'm Sara Roversi, as said. I'm super glad to be with you today. I'm super glad to be with you today because I think that the topic we are talking about is one of the most relevant one. We are, of course, in one of the hardest time in history for us, for sure. But also we know that we have 10 years, now 9 years left to achieve the goals. And this is a priority. It's not something that we can consider just something to mention in our CSR strategies. It's something that needs to be part of the business strategy, needs to be part of the actions, because this is the decade of action where we are. I'm very excited today because I'm together with an incredible group of people that is going to bring many different perspectives from many different angles, not only of the food chain, but also of the stakeholders that are supporting the chain to expand, to grow, to thrive in this time in history. So I want to start just asking to all our guests to spend like 2 minutes before you jump in the answer to introduce yourself, to share with our audience who you are and what your organization is doing. And I want to start with Robin Willoughby, asking something related to our chains, asking, let's say, how are we going to feed this growing population, the famous 10 billion people, both preserving the environment, but feeding them sustainably. The topic of access to food is going to be a huge challenge. We are in a situation where this global pandemic is exposing us to many different issues. Both people is poorer, they don't have sometimes access to good food, but this issue is going to be something that we're going to see in every part of the world.
Thanks, Sarah. Yeah, my name is Robin Willoughby. I'm the UK director at Mighty Earth. And prior to that, I worked at Oxfam and at Chatham House. So this is an issue that I'm really, really passionate about. So to frame the early part of this discussion, I thought I'd sort of mention 3 headline stats, really, to give us a sense of what we're dealing with. So the first is that prior to COVID-19, almost 700 million people were estimated to be undernourished by the UN. So this is prior to COVID. And as a trend, global hunger levels have increased year on year since 2014. But I think that underneath these headline statistics, there are millions of stories of hardship and suffering, with people cutting back on meals due to lack of income, skipping meals entirely or using lower quality, less nutritious ingredients in their food. I think it's also important to recognize that hunger isn't something that sort of happens over there in lower income and middle income countries. There were some really shocking statistics that came out in the UK actually by the Food Standards Agency in the summer, which showed that mid part of 2020, 7.8 million people in England, Wales and Scotland were food insecure, which is 16% of the adult population. The second headline stat that I wanted to give to the audience is really that the global greenhouse gas emissions are increasing year on year. So despite agreements on climate change, the WMO shows that emissions increased the highest levels in 2018 and 2019. So we're significantly off track to meet the Paris Agreement goal of 1.5 degrees and currently on a trajectory of 3 to 5 degrees warming from pre-industrial levels, which will be catastrophic for food systems, but also for humans that live on this planet. But finally, the third thing to flag is that when we think of reduction in emissions in the food system, or emissions generally, we often think of fossil fuels in the energy system. And I think this is partly because it's a big part of the problem, but also because it's quite visible. We can imagine pollution from fossil fuels, but food and farming is actually a huge part of the picture in tackling climate change. It accounts for 1/3 of all global emissions. So even if we produced all of our energy from solar, wind, and geothermal, and electrified all forms of transport, we'd still not be able to meet the Paris goals without fundamentally rethinking agriculture and ending deforestation. So in summary, these three stats really give us a stark picture of quite a broken food system. Hunger levels are rising, emissions are also rising, and industrial agriculture is a significant driver of the problem. So in terms of the solution, the way that I look at this is that there are a number of policies we can put in place that could tackle hunger, but significantly worsen climate change. There are a number of policies we can put in place that could tackle climate change, but end up resulting in increased poverty and inequality. So what we really need to do is find that sort of sweet spot in the middle of policies and frameworks that can tackle poverty and climate change simultaneously. And this isn't really what we're doing currently. It requires a paradigm shift in our thinking, in my view. So in the social space, the kind of things we should be thinking about are really social protection schemes that can create green jobs, for example. But in food and agriculture, the kind of things that we should be looking at is fundamental switch to agroecology systems, agroforestry where it's possible, alongside a wholesale change in our diets. So I just wanted to give that kind of overall framing of some of the problems that we're facing and where I see some of the solutions.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. And I think we should stick on the topic of how might we reshape the food chain and the distribution part, because before that, I was thinking we just have 9 agricultural seasons ahead. 9 agricultural seasons ahead is nothing if we have to consider the pace of nature. And this change needs to happen fast. So now I want to go on in our deep dive into this relationship between SDGs and food, together with Catherine David from Fairtrade. Because of course, we need to think how might we reshape food chains to make sure we can keep this balance, preserve the planet, feeding the planet.
Thank you, Sarah. So my name's Catherine David. I'm the head of commercial partnerships at the Fair Trade Foundation. We work with businesses, farmers, workers to create a fairer food system. And at the heart of our model is fair prices, and in particular, the concepts of living income and living wages. To build on some of the stats that Robin mentioned, smallholder farmers, so those are farmers with land of less than 2 hectares, account for 70% of world food provision. So they are providing this food to the world. They're at the heart of our global agricultural system. But they're also not food secure. So what we see in fair trade is that around 56% to 60% of the money, the additional fair trade premium money that those farmers receive, they spend on SDG 2, zero hunger, food security, which I think is a really interesting thing for us to consider. When you think about living income, we did a study earlier this year that showed that on average, a cocoa farmer in West Africa, in Ivory Coast, where most of the world's cocoa comes from, is earning 78p a day. For women, particularly when you break it down, 28p a day. So this is not only way below the living income line, it's well below the extreme poverty line. And we have to ask ourselves the question of, of both how we expect these smallholder farmers to continue feeding us, the rest of the world, how they're going to be able to feed themselves, and then how they're going to be good stewards of the environment and the natural world. And when you talk about deforestation, it's a crisis happening in West Africa in cocoa. So that's just to give you a few examples to build on Robin's point of what some of the changes might be, what the depth of the challenge might be. The climate change also, they're at the front line. These farmers are at the front line of this. So we're seeing in coffee in particular, for example, farmers having to move their whole farms up the mountain to find altitudes where coffee can still grow. That's the kind of livelihoods crisis that we have not seen for generations, and it's now systematic. And then, of course, I'm going to use the C word, COVID. For a lot of communities, this is a crisis on top of a crisis on top of a crisis. They're already subject to volatile world market prices, very low incomes, low access to information, changes due to climate change. And then this public health crisis arrives, and they simply don't, in general, have the means and resources to adapt and to deal with the volatility. So I think from a fair trade perspective, we think that in order to solve this paradox or square this circle and look for those policies that are good for food security and good for the environment, as Robin mentioned, we need to be thinking quite clearly about the role of small-scale farmers and critically their livelihoods and their incomes.
Thank you so much, Catherine. Actually, while you were talking, I was thinking how much we're going to see this topic in the next priorities of the next G20, for example, or at COP26. Are we going to make it to have the food reshape, the food system reshape that is needed in the top priorities? Because here we're talking about something that is crucial for everyone, more than anything else. Thank you so much for sharing. And now, let's say, I want to keep going on investigating with all the facilitators of the entire system. And of course, we need to talk also about the role of finance. Which role plays finance now? How finance can drive those investments in a way that can become positively impactful, that can really shape the industry and support the growth of industry, startup, innovation that can really have this impact. And to share some thoughts about that, I would love to hear from Michael Kleindl, that is the managing partner of Blue Horizon Ventures, because this is something that for sure can accelerate the process.
Thank you, Sarah, so much for the introduction. Thanks for everyone listening into probably one of the most, if not the most prominent problem we face on Earth. So my name is Michael Kleindl. I'm a founder and managing partner of Blue Horizon Ventures. We are a venture capital firm based out of Zurich. And as Sarah mentioned, we are investors. And maybe despite, or other than the public sectors, we 3 years ago with my partners in the fund and the firm decided to tackle that that problem with capital. We started off with the little money we had. This is obviously not enough, and then decided to establish a system of funds. So currently managing a first vehicle, a first venture capital fund with 200 million euros. And what we do is exactly tackling the topics, which is how do we feed 10 billion people going forward? And how do we do that in a sustainable way? So the thesis for us when looking globally into investments into that space is really sustainability in the food system. So we tackle this the topic of how can we substitute animal agriculture, which is, if you really dig a little bit deeper into that, there is zillions of problems related to that, from gas house emissions, animal welfare, land use, and antibiotics. And I mean, it's just almost endless. So sometimes feels like, Jesus Christ, how as mankind have we gotten here, 2020, and still, killing 70 billion animals a year to feed. And there's no need. It's just the most inefficient thing we have been developing. We cut the Amazonas rainforest to grow soybeans, and we we feed the soybeans to the cows and afterwards to kill the cows. So why don't we eat the soy, just as an example, directly and have the proteins from the source? So it's a completely, sorry for the language, fucked up system. And so we decided, in a way, it can only, as an investor, I believe in the private sector, it can only work and can be changed with capital. And so we are supporting and we are looking globally for young entrepreneurs who are moving into that sector. And as there's more capital coming, there are more entrepreneurs coming. So it's a virtuous circle, which is actually happening, which is good news. And in that we're looking for innovation, how to really, and I hate that word because it has been so much used, but to really, really disrupt that food system, that food industry with innovation. And the moment you start looking into that, we are now doing that since a couple of years, suddenly there is hope at the end of the tunnel, because innovation is happening. And it looks like it's happening faster than what at least me personally, I was expecting. And then thanks to the C word, COVID, thanks to COVID, we talk probably about that a little bit later, there is a big change in consciousness around consumers and investors all around the world. And there is really more and more capital flowing into that sector, which is about, we have to change. In the food system, it's food, but it's obviously food waste and it's packaging, plastic stuff, etc. So that's what I mean. We decided to dedicate 24 hours a day on that topic, and I think what we are seeing is a great bunch of innovation and cool startups in that space, alternative proteins or designed proteins, lab-grown meat. I mean, there's a long list of stuff happening, which hopefully will scale at such speed that shortly we will have sufficient supply, sustainable supply to feed mankind.
Thank you so much. And now, of course, I have been mentioning the G20 and COP26, but also 2021 is going to be a very crucial year for all the UN, because have been announced the UN Food System Summit taking place next year as well. And probably this is the big voice that we needed to hear, requesting a very quick resolution of this issue. And so now I would love to invite in this virtual stage Eva Mulder, that is at UNEP, to learn more really what's the approach, how you are approaching and facilitating the development of those business strategies, those business projects, the implementation to accelerate this change that is needed.
Thanks, Sarah, and thanks also to the organizers for the kind invitation. So within UNEP, I lead the climate finance unit, which specifically focuses on actively unlocking public and especially private finance for sustainable land use. I think as both Robin, Catherine, and Michael indicated, and also Sarah at the introduction, there's a fundamental shift that is needed. From my own perspective, the way we try to do that is by setting up a number of so-called blended finance funds. We've set up one fund with Mirova and Rabobank and others called the Agri-Free Fund that currently has 90 million in committed capital. And that can basically act as a carrot to facilitate those banks that are willing to change to be provided with either soft loans or guarantees, as long as it improves rural livelihoods on the ground, as long as it leads to forest protection and sustainable agricultural production. Because in many cases, a bank would say, I find it interesting, or an investor would say, I find it interesting, but it's often outside the realm of what a credit committee or an investment committee would find acceptable in terms of the risk-adjusted return. So I think what is needed at this crucial stage is to stimulate more funds and banks to become active in it. So we have, besides the Agri-Free Fund that can basically lower the risk for banks, we've recently launched a restoration seed capital facility that basically will pay part of the cost for fund managers that set up new funds that have a focus on forest and landscape restoration and that try to bring more projects to financial close. So this is what we try to do on the production side, and basically use financial incentives as basically a carrot to make that change. But as you said, Sarah, that there is a fundamental change basically that needs to happen across the food system from basically farm to fork. And what the UN would have normally called the super year for nature in 2020 is now going to be called the super year for nature 2021, because many of those global meetings were basically shifted. I do believe that whether it's the CBD biodiversity COP in Kunming next year, whether it's the climate COP 26 in London next year, or the Food System Summit, all of them will have a big focus on transforming the way we're producing and consuming our food, whether it's from a biodiversity perspective, a climate perspective, or a food systems perspective. So I would also hope that this conference can sort of help those participants to think how to be a force for positive change in that respect. So I think to summarize, I think within my own unit, sort of trying, like Michael, to use finance as a lever for positive change, while at the same time I think we need the policy changes that Robin, for example, was alluding to, and a fundamental change in the way we're producing it.
Yes, definitely. I also hope that on top of the dialogues, there's going to be a lot of action around. And now I think it could be interesting to start to understand better how might we really see the SDGs applied to this transformation that is needed. How do you think we can really help the NGOs on the ground, the industry on the ground, the consumers, to really understand the connection and really change the way we are distributing and consuming food, starting from the SDGs, how the framework can be the guideline. And so, Robin, maybe I'm gonna come back to you to open this second circle of comments and thoughts.
Thanks, and thanks for the contributions of the others on the panel as well. I mean, the SDGs, from my perspective, are a very useful framework as they've been picked up by the private sector, including investors. So this is a really good thing that there's traction. But I see a couple of flaws, if you like. First is that there's little accountability for member states in actually meeting them. And on the private sector side, I get the sense there's also somewhat of a little bit of kind of picking and choosing of SDGs that might be of most interest rather than looking at them as a package as a whole. So my view is really that the SDGs are most effective as a framework when they're taken as a whole, and the companies can look at which ones they can further and enhance, but also which they might be undermining in their own operations and in their supply chains. So my perspective is really that the SDGs can be very useful for companies, in particular if they use them as a framework to undertake due diligence of their own operations and their supply chain. The due diligence for me in this perspective is really undertaking a risk analysis, an assessment and mitigation measures around the SDG framework, particularly sort of robust due diligence on deforestation and human rights violations in the supply chain is incredibly important. And this should be looking at their own direct suppliers, but also their indirect suppliers. So that's kind of one way that I think the SDGs can be extremely useful for companies, using them as a whole package, but also using them as a framework for due diligence in their operations and supply chain.
Thank you so much. And welcome also to Martin Frick, who joined us. He's the Deputy Secretary of the Special Envoy for the UN Food System Summit. We just mentioned actually the Food System Summit, and while you just meet us, I would love you to be part of the conversation, taking the inspiration from one of the questions that just arrived from the audience. Basically, the audience is asking if really we can achieve the goals when we know today that many of the guidelines or anyway the eating habits yet are not reaching the goals set by the Paris Agreement. And do you think that in the next future, so are you optimistic that this change can happen? I know that Food System Summit came to life with the intention to do it, but the challenges are pretty high.
Right. Well, thank you, and apologies for being late. I had a meeting I just simply couldn't stop before. But I'm very happy to be here. And, let me start by saying I'm an incurable optimist. I think that's what brings you in this job. And I would even make a rather naive statement, but I think it's kind of true, that the beauty of the Sustainable Development Goals is that there's actually a commitment of people to create a better world, as naive as that sounds. And failing to do so has resulted in the last years by children going on the streets and basically calling out us adults and telling us, what on earth are you doing with our planet? So I am optimistic that things are possible, and I am for two reasons. One is that I think at the latest, the COVID crisis has convinced people that we really are in a crisis. It's not a luxury problem. It's not some tree huggers telling us that there is climate change. This is all over us. And wherever you go, I'm talking to you currently out of Germany, we have droughts, extended droughts in that country that's not particularly known for sunshine. Obviously, wherever you are in the world, you see this situation. So what has been lacking over so many years, the consciousness is now there. And that translates into elections, that translates into election platforms. It's finally a mainstream issue. And the second thing is, and again, I relate that to COVID, but COVID only as a little nudge on top of everything, is that people start to think about all of this, change that needs to happen on both sides, on the social and equity side, as much as on the environmental side, as not something that's threatening your lifestyle, that's questioning the way in which you are used to live, but it's actually opening the door to quite a beautiful life. It's asking fundamental questions about what's important in your life. Is that the latest revision of your Porsche, or is that having more time with your old parents or your children, connecting you with your friends, eating food that actually makes you healthy and not sick, working with products that that they don't have blood on their backside. These issues, and I think this is coming really into a mainstream consciousness. And so I truly believe the time is right to write down a new consensus, a new common ground, because I think the last 2 or 3 years were most remarkable. And we are really about to define a new societal consensus, which has also a very interesting mix between most local commitments and actions and really global issues such as climate change or the pandemic or the loss of biodiversity. And the tool that brings that together, obviously, and I'm talking to a laptop here, is our digital connectiveness. And so, yeah, I am hopeful, and I hand back to you, and I'm looking forward to more questions.
I'm hopeful too, even if, of course, for example, Catherine, just before she was sharing really the state of the art. People don't see how things are going in the farms in many different parts of the world, and how much we consume coffee, cocoa, many food commodities without thinking which are the working conditions and the issues they're facing. Also, many times due to climate change, how they are suffering for that. So it's interesting to reflect also on the wordings that we are using, because the food as a commodity. There's going to be a day where food is not going to be considered anymore just as a commodity, but with all the values that food represent. I'm always wondering that. And Catherine, I would love you to come back with me, really to share with us, how do you see this change will happen, and how do you see really the SDGs implemented also from the farm side, from the producer side, because I'm sure that fair trade has a deep understanding of that part of the chain.
Yeah, definitely. And so the way that fair trade works, we have a few key mechanisms. One is fair trade minimum price. So this is a price that we set to cover the costs of sustainable production, which is paid to fair trade producers when the world market price goes below that level. And in some product areas like coffee, for example, the world market price has frequently been below that level. And so the fair trade minimum price provides a safety net, which sounds nice, but importantly, it provides stability for planning. So fair trade coffee producer organizations are able to get financing on the strength of their fair trade contracts and that long-term commitment to pay that price. And then the other key mechanism is what we call fair trade premium. This is an additional sum of money that is paid to fair trade producer organizations by their end customers. So when you buy a cup of fair trade coffee, that means an extra sum of money has gone directly to that farmer organization. I gave you a stat earlier about the usage of that premium money by smallholder farmers and how much of that is used on food security. In my time at Fair Trade, 10 years or so, I visited lots of different farmer organizations, and what you see is a full spectrum. So I've been to visit smallholder tea farmers in Malawi who are using their fair trade premium money to dig wells in their communities to access clean water, to electrify their villages, to cover their basic needs. So access to clean water in their community means that women are not walking 2 hours to the river and back every day to collect dirty water from the river. Massive change to their lives. And at the other end of the spectrum, I've seen coffee farms in Rwanda, for example, who've been in fair trade for some time and have used their fair trade premium to buy cows. And that cow investment is a food security investment because it provides milk and nourishment for the community. But then a couple of years after the cows, they bought a yogurt processing facility and it became a revenue stream. So I think what we see in the fair trade system is farmers coming in often without the benefits of being part of an organized structure, forming themselves into cooperatives, through that process accessing resources, information, money, but also power, voice, advocacy with the local government, networks of other producer organizations. So there's a real journey there and a system transformation. The SDGs, to return to the question, I think has been a really useful framework for helping smallholder farmers like that, and particularly unions of smallholder farmers as they come together to communicate directly with their end buyers. So that when you have a Ben & Jerry's or a co-op supermarket that says, okay, we really care about the SDGs, and their farmer organizations say, okay, well, we really care about the SDGs too. So what can we do together? I think that shared language can be really helpful. And I think to Robin's point earlier, through fair trade, what we see is some of those conversations helping avoid the picking and choosing, basically. So I was nodding along with Robin when he said we call it 17 by 17 when you go onto a business's website and they have the 17 SDGs and then a list of 17 projects. It can be a comms exercise, but what we see through the fair trade supply chains is that farmers are really coming back to their end buyers and saying, okay, if you're really serious about this and this framework, then here's what we'd like to do. Are you our partners in this? And that's where I think the magic and the real change can happen.
I want to just ask you something. In this 10 years, what have you seen happening in the industry? How much fair trade became more present in public procurement, or anyway, big procurement inside big industries? Have you seen, I assume, a big transition on that?
I've seen, I guess there's two ways of looking at it. There's sort of sales of fair trade products, which is one thing to look at, but also just business behavior and sector behavior. And for me, I came into fair trade and was working on chocolate primarily and cocoa. And that, I'd say, is the commodity that we work on that I've seen at the kind of forefront of this, at the vanguard. There's deep, deep poverty, deep problems with child labor, deep problems with deforestation. And so I think the concepts that we've developed, like living income, that 10 years ago would have been considered completely unaffordable, non-mainstream and niche, are now at the center of a whole sector transformation conversation. And just today, Ben & Jerry's have committed to paying increased incomes to all the cocoa farmers in their supply chain. And that's a really big, so yeah. So this is starting to happen, and 10 years ago when I joined, that would have been unimaginable. I think we'll see similar things happening in coffee and other product areas too. So there is a lot of, there's been a huge amount of hype. I have a chart I use with my team for inductions where we talk about the business drivers for working with fair trade. And 10 years ago, we would have said it's primarily a brand thing. It's primarily a sort of signaling to my consumers that I care thing. Whereas now I would say that's still important, and the sort of storytelling side is important, but equally as important is the impact. And is this investment that I'm making through fair trade leading to a tangible, measurable, long-term positive impact in my supply chain, and also managing the risks that Robin mentioned, the human rights and environmental rights due diligence risks. So I'd say beyond any kind of sales numbers for the fair trade model in particular, I'd say what I've seen in the last 10 years is a mainstreaming of some of the concepts that 10 years ago would have been seen as quite niche and a bit idealistic.
Thank you. I'm pretty optimistic too, also because I see many business leaders that knows what's the risk long term and are starting strategizing not anymore just short term, but also focusing on what's going to be the impact in 10, 20, 50 years ahead. So let's hope, really. And now I would love to go back to the financial side of the business, trying to understand more how SDGs are driving also the choices at that level, because of course this is crucial to lead the investment in a way that is going to be impactful. So Michael, if you can join me.
I do rejoin you very happily. Yes, I think the SDGs are a very fundamental element for our work, and for us that is a crucial part of any investment thesis. And once we have set these objectives for ourselves, we translate that into any due diligence of a possible portfolio company. And we have gone so far that we really conduct, let's call it sustainability workshops with the possible investment opportunities prior to any term sheet or prior to any further negotiations. And that goes really probably even deeper than what only the 17 SDGs are. It's like a 360-degree deep dive due diligence on what are your working conditions on the farm where you source the pea protein. I don't know. I mean, it really all the stuff. So we take that very seriously. Once a company passes that threshold and they end up in portfolio, then we do report on certain KPIs. We do annual audits. And so this is really happening. And if then a founder or entrepreneur doesn't want to play, he's out. So he doesn't receive the capital. So that's digital. But the good news is, going back to my earlier comment, there is a real change happening, and the awareness, as we just heard, the awareness in the last 2-3 years, and it would be interesting to find a study what really happened, that this is now so different. I mean, fair trade, Catherine said, okay, it's 10 years on that awareness that we have to eat healthier, more sustainable. I know that it's just so different in just 2, 3, maybe 4 years. It's mind-blowing. And so the entrepreneurs who are embarking a journey of doing a food tech startup or sustainable startup, they come very, very mission aligned, because they are probably of an age group who is driving that change. We talked about Greta. I mean, it's the young people. Is it the millennials, or is it the Generation Z who are probably driving some of the older senior management in the big corporates crazy? And then now everyone is talking about impact. Everyone is talking ESG, SDG, and etc. because they're forcing the big corporates to change. And then at the same time, big innovation is never happening at the big corporates. Then it goes down to the startup worlds. And that's where, I mean, the people who are really embarking these journeys, they are super mission aligned. They do this. Yes, it's a business, but it's a fine line. From business, it's always there has to be the purpose. So why am I doing the plant-based cheese company? Or why am I doing because I'm doing it because I want to play my role in saving the planet. And yes, if I can make some money, that's fine. But for most of them, and it's no longer the tree hugger, which we had 15 years back, and that was no impact. I mean, it's nice, you know, the vegans somewhere in the corner, these hippie crazy guys, okay, forget it. This is not mass market, but now it's mainstream, it's mass market, and that what is really changing. So for many of these entrepreneurs, you don't need to talk SDGs to them. I mean, they have that in their heart. They're doing that for passion. They have suffered the forests in Germany being now killed by this Borkenkäfer thing, or you name it. So they come from an experience, and they're doing that because they want to play their little part in hopefully achieving the goals quicker than we have set the targets, which is going to be challenging. But let's hope. Let's hope.
Very, very, very challenging. And Ivo, we have a question for you from the audience. They're asking, what technologies do you think have the greatest potential to improve the sustainability of food production and agriculture?
That's a very challenging question to answer. I mean, maybe I can give a start, but perhaps for other panelists to follow up. Actually, in about 20 minutes, I'm supposed to give a presentation to the Green Digital Finance Alliance, and I think technology will have to play a huge part in how we transform our food system. I think various panelists have already referred to the problem of deforestation. It is unfeasible to ask consultants to go to individual farms and check whether deforestation does not take place. So that will have to be done through remote sensing using satellite imagery and probably also artificial intelligence, where you have machine learning that basically do this in a cost-effective way, where images of avoided deforestation or restoration are automatically being captured and are a small part of the transaction cost of a potential deal. In the same way, I can imagine that, as Michael was saying, there's going to be a big push to have positive impact embedded into this. And again, I think technology will play a big role because investors like Blue Horizon Capital, but also the farmer organizations that Catherine is working with, will be increasingly asked to provide data that can be grouped and shown how that links to the SDGs. So whether we're using satellite technology, whether it is client information from individual farmers that goes to farmer associations, that then goes to investors and ultimately to governments, that will require a huge databases and artificial intelligence to really capture that information. So I think it is really sort of like the glue to make that ultimately happening and to do it in a cost-effective way. So I'm not sure if there's anything that panelists would sort of want to follow up on. I see Robert.
Maybe Michael, they mentioned Michael and Ivo, so actually we want also your answer, Michael.
Yes, yeah, I mean, when it comes to food production and food supply, I mean, we are of the firm belief that we have to take out the animal in that equation. And that leads to then new technologies, how we produce food and mainly proteins, which, well, you know, animal are the sources for protein. And then we can talk about, you know, synthetic biology, which is basically fermentation technologies where we design proteins in bioreactors at industrial scale. That's clearly technology of the future and will be part of the solution. We are talking about cultivated or cultured food, which is for some consumers still scary, and we'll see consumer acceptance way in the future. But is basically growing meat, fish, whatever it is, in a bioreactor instead of in animal, with leaving aside all the negative consequences of mass industrial livestock. And then the most easiest ones, and that what we've probably all already experienced in the last years, is just substituting animals with plants. And not, again, what I mentioned earlier, why we feed the cow with the soy, eat the soy directly. And, you know, get rid of all the massive inefficiencies. And so I think it's, and in that plant-based spectrum, we see a lot of innovation which make the final product for consumers just healthier, tastier, which is ultimately needed because we talk food, and if we want to leave that 1%, 2% vegan corner and take it mainstream, the products they have to taste. I mean, we do that 2-3 times a day, and I think these are the fundamental technologies which will make that change happen. And there's a lot of stuff going on.
Thank you so much. I would say also tackling the topic of food waste. We see many innovation happening in the field as well, and also many industries being able to transform something that was a waste and a huge value. So entering in new markets with sub-products, upcycling waste and transforming it. So it's interesting to talk also about sustainability from a very inclusive perspective, because industries are going to be even more motivated if this is not going to be just an investment because it's good to do, but also because it's creating prosperity. So I think that this is an interesting thing to be highlighted even more, to inspire more entrepreneurs to invest more in sustainability. Then now I would love just to, for this last round of thoughts, to think about the moment we're living. We are in Europe, at least in this second wave of COVID. We have a very important and crucial year ahead, 2021. We need really to raise the attention and make sure that the 17th goal is going to be the one leading the conversation. And we had many questions coming from the crowd asking also how my policy can rebalance the investment, maybe with taxation that are gonna, of course, say, give some direction, plastic tax or other kind of tax that maybe can shape a little bit the system also from this perspective. So I wanna ask first of all to Martin to jump and kick off this last round of thoughts, starting to think about what's going to be the good we're going to learn out of this COVID pandemic and how the COVID pandemic has been reshaping in some way the system. And if and how do you think that policymakers can change the system with different implementation, different policies, different laws?
Well, thank you. In such a complex and central thing like food system, it's the same thing like climate change. You need all the actors at the same time in place. And, you know, in climate change, we had for a very long time this chicken and egg game, where basically the producers said, well, if the consumers demand, we deliver. And the consumers said, well, if we would have a decent choice, then this could be happening. So I think what I'm saying is you need in certain areas a nudge by policy making. You need to start by stopping perverse incentives, subsidies, and things that don't make sense anymore. And there are quite a few of those. Then, of course, you know, this summit is going to be in September next year. The time frame is not there to negotiate a long instrument. And I think we cannot afford to go down the same rabbit hole like the climate negotiations and enter 25 years in negotiations around texts. So the approach we are taking is we leave that in the hands of sovereign nation states, but we are triggering discussions in every single nation of the UN membership, that's more than 190, in the hope that the different stakeholder groups would come together and find what is appropriate and needed in their countries. And it might be, in many cases, also regulatory frameworks, updated policy. I'm struck, you know, the colleague from Fairtrade spoke before me now, and I'm always wondering, you know, I never seen the label unfair trade. And all the goods that are produced in a way that is not sustainable, not fair, not climate friendly, they are not only still the default in so many places, they are also enjoying much more the benefit of money. So if you're in a supermarket, these are the products that you have on eye level. And the good products, those that you actually should be buying, are often somewhere hidden in the lowest shelf. So we have to work collectively to create a different standard in which the good products are basically what the standard is, and the not so good products are basically less placed in that. But it needs push and pull. It needs the offer from the producer. It needs the readiness and the education of the consumers, and often it needs a little bit of nudging from the policy side. And last sentence, you can get to this policy engagement at the very moment when you broaden the scope. If you, for example, not say, oh, the organic product is more expensive, well, the actual product might be, but if you look at, the environmental impact, the health impact, the resilience of a population against a pandemic, which is a direct function of nutrition, then the calculation looks very differently. So we have to look at the real price, and we have to factor in externalities, and legal framework can help doing that.
Thank you. And I will take advantage of what you said to invite people to join the conversation. We started on October 16th, the first global dialogue with the UN Food Systems Summit as a Future Food Institute, but now many dialogues are hosted in different parts of the world. So I think it's the time to talk, to be part of the conversation, to grow together, and to come up with the ideas that are needed to reshape the food systems. So now, sorry if I was telling that, Martin, but I think everyone now can join the conversation. There are tons of ways on how people can really be part of the change. So I think it's important to highlight that for the audience. Now, we, of course, are almost at the end of our panel. I would love to get some keywords from you, from all your different industry, all your different companies, organizations. I think that in the name of the partnership for the goals that are needed is the most important SDGs. I strongly believe that. All of you can share a thought, a keyword, what you think is needed. There are tons of questions that came up related to regenerative agriculture. How can we help the industry to change? How can incentivize them? Please, I'm not gonna interrupt you. I'm gonna ask you just to share your thought very quickly, starting from Robin again.
Thanks. So my one word thought is radical, actually. Changes are happening, but they're too slow and they're too fragmented. So if we're going to tackle the challenges that we've been discussing, we need radical thinking and radical change. So my one word is radical. Let's think radically, think big, let's accelerate.
Thank you. Catherine.
Accountability. Let's not just trust each other. Let's hold each other accountable to these changes. Civil society, consumers in your roles as voters, shoppers, stakeholders. You can't wait for this to happen. You need to push. And as individuals who work in companies, as individuals who work in government, you have more power than you think. So accountability to each other and accountability to the future.
Thank you. Michael.
I would say inclusive. That is not done by any party on its own. As we just heard, we need everyone in the system to be part of it. So inclusive is my word.
Great. Ivo, it's your turn.
I mean, I had a bit of time to think. I would say integration. I think as Robin was alluding to, both within the UN, which I'm working for, as well as NGOs and business, there has been a focus on let's tackle food security, or let's tackle the climate crisis, and it's not been done in an integrated way. So it is, if we want to make the food systems more sustainable, the World Health Organization should also focus on the environmental SDGs, and UNEP should also focus on the social ones. So I think integration is key. And the second point I would like to make is, I mean, within UNEP and the UN, we often talk about building back better. But at the moment, it is more like building back like business as usual. About 1/3 of all the public money that governments have announced as part of the COVID stimulus is going to be to nature and climate destructive activities, with no incentives attached to having airlines change the way they fly, integrating the environmental externalities in it. So my plea to those who are on this conference today is to then also act upon it, whether we're a business, whether it's citizens or NGOs, is to put the pressure and really make sure that we act on it. I think the narrative itself is not, is there.
Yes. I think that the balance is between the Great Reset and the Build Back Better, because actually I see more a Great Reset. I hope in a Great Reset now. So what you were saying actually connects me to what also Pope Francis said, talking about the integral ecology and the needs to move into the concept of integral ecology. So thank you so much for raising that. And Martin, you have the last keyword, is the toughest one, because very good one has been already shared before you.
I mean, firstly, I agree with every single keyword that was shared. Michael stole mine because I wanted to speak about inclusiveness, but this point has been made. Let me add one thing, and I think that is also what Ivo said without using the word system thinking. We can only come to a solution if we understand that food is a system, and that it's an absolute massive and central system that we need to get right for the SDGs. And, you know, system thinking sounds always so nice, but it's a pretty uncomfortable thing because you're constantly having to do with people who have a different set of expertise, and you are pushed outside your comfort zone. And that's exactly what we need to do. So system thinking.
Thank you so much. And this was your world because of the UN Food System Summit. So thank you so much. So it's been a great panel. Thank you all for sharing those thoughts. I took a lot of notes. Every time is a huge opportunity of learning. I invite all of you to never stop learning, never stop hunting the numbers, believe in the science, because this is really what is needed now. The audience is saying we need radical thinking. So Robin, yes, we need radical thinking and we need this change happen now. I thank you, the organization, for raising the awareness on this topic and for inviting all of us, so diverse, to share those thoughts about the balance we need to find in the food system and the need of really framing every single choices and sticking with the SDGs, because this is what is needed now. It's almost time to eat here in Italy. It's lunchtime. So I want to invite you all, each time you gather around the table, to honor your past, to engage with the people that are convening with you, sharing experience, thoughts, and traditions through food, but also be conscious, because every single bite is connecting you to the future, is helping you to build the future. We are all eaters. Even if you're not connected with the food system, that is tough and discomfort not to be connected with, but anyway, you're eating. You're lucky many times a day. So please be careful and be conscious about what you're doing. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for this opportunity. And we hope you're gonna spend many other hours together, deep diving into the topic of food and SDGs.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Sarah. I just want to add to that comment and really thank you all for an outstanding panel. It was very informative and great moderating work by Sarah. I agree, it is lunchtime across Europe. So everyone enjoy your lunch. We'll see you in half an hour for our War on Waste session, and do get in touch with the panelists on Swapcard to get further information and ask any questions. So thank you all. A virtual round of applause, please, for everyone. Thank you. And enjoy the rest of the conference.
Thanks.